Fear the Pale blew what we left ourselves Episode 3. Displacement. The coffee had gone cold an hour ago. Renn hadn't touched it since she set it on the corner of the desk just before midnight, when she'd moved from her kitchen table to the secondary workspace and decided to stay until something gave. The mug sat 3 inches from the edge, handle turned out the way she always left it, the surface of the coffee gone matte and still. Outside the window, Wisconsin Avenue was empty in the way Georgetown got empty after 2 in the morning. Not quiet, not the quiet of a place at rest, but the flat absence of a street whose regular noise had simply cleared out, and the absence made a sound of its own. She had been in this between assignment period for 4 days. The secondary workspace was a one-room office the ICD maintained in a building on P Street, 3 blocks from her apartment, 3rd floor above a private wealth management firm that kept weekday hours and paid no attention to what happened above them. The desk was bolted to the wall, 2 flat monitors, a dedicated terminal running on a closed circuit that connected to the ICD's administrative backbone without routing through the main campus. The circuit wasn't officially documented in any file she could access, which was part of why she'd chosen this room over the apartment. She'd used this office twice before, both times when she needed a layer of separation between herself and a piece of work that required care. This was not an operation, harder to name than that. She kept the overhead light off, a flat white tube fixture mounted too high, the kind that flattened everything in the room and made you feel like you were waiting to speak to someone who wasn't coming. She worked by the desk lamp instead, a small adjustable thing she'd brought herself and kept in the bottom drawer. It lit the desk and the near wall and left the rest of the room in the dark behind her. The building had steam heat and a pipe ran behind the east wall, knocking at irregular intervals, sometimes 20 minutes apart, sometimes 40. The window above the desk faced northwest. She could see the bare upper branches of the oak at the corner of P and 30th, black lines against the city gray sky. On the desk, in no particular order, a yellow legal pad, the top third covered in handwritten columns, a glass of water she'd meant to refill since midnight, a printed copy of the ICD's Internal Administrative Reference Manual, 2026 edition, the document every operative received during induction and most filed away and never opened again. Renn had it open to Section 4. This was the 3rd time she'd read it in as many days. The first read had been general, pulling the language into her head without targeting anything. The second had been targeted. She'd gone in looking for the footnote she'd half-registered on the first pass, found it, and spent an hour thinking about what it meant before she started building the search string. A third read was to confirm she hadn't misread the format specifications in the taxonomy tables. She was about to run a query based on her inference about the format, and if the inference was wrong, she'd get nothing back, which would look like absence of evidence rather than a flaw in her methodology. The format had to be right before she committed to it. The format was right. She turned the manual face down on the desk and went back to the terminal. The routing architecture of the ICD was not, in principle, complicated. Assignments moved through a standardized sequence of handoffs, a file constructed at an origin level, tagged with the parameters of the intended operative's profile, processed through an automated distribution system that matched those parameters to task requirements, then delivered to the operative's channel. Every handoff generated a log entry: construction, profile tagging, routing decision, delivery confirmation. The system recorded each step, and the records were retained in a tiered index that operatives could access within the limits of their clearance. The key word was within. The index was tiered, and what you could see in it depended entirely on where your clearance placed you in the hierarchy. She was Tier 4. Tier 4 gave her access to the index records associated with her own assignment history, the operational logs for closed operations she'd run, the administrative records relevant to her current active assignments, and a set of cross-referencing tools the ICD called the Backbone Query Suite. What it didn't give her was the construction origin for any file. Every file's origin showed as an internal node identifier, 8 digits, nothing more, mapping to one of the 47 active nodes in the current architecture. She tried on the first day to cross-reference those node identifiers against the operational directory and hit a wall. The operational directory at her tier showed node identifiers as administrative infrastructure with no further detail. Mapping a node to a real operational unit, a division, a handler, a person, required clearance above Tier 4, so the construction origin was unavailable. What she could trace was movement. She'd started with the 2 anomalous assignments she already knew about. The first had arrived 11 weeks ago, a routine-looking protection and retrieval job routed to her channel through a path that was, on close inspection, wrong. She'd noticed the routing path at the time, flagged it in the watching place, completed the assignment, said nothing. The second had come in 3 weeks after that, same type, preservation, not closure, which was not work that should reach a closer's channel at all. And when she'd run the backward trace on the routing path, she'd found the same structure. Both assignments had moved through handoffs outside her standard distribution branch and both terminated when she followed the path to its end, at a routing destination she couldn't access. Not a node number she could look up, not a handler code that matched anything in the operational directory. A blank, clean, featureless, the same display the system returned when a record didn't exist or when a record was above your clearance to see. She couldn't tell which condition she was looking at, and the inability to tell was the first thing she'd written in the legal pad. 4 days ago, she'd started the second phase of the work. The problem with tracing movement was that it told her where the paths led, but not what was generating them. She needed to understand the structure, not just the terminus of the 2 assignments she'd received, but the architecture around them. What kind of infrastructure produced paths that looked like that? What tier of the program would leave that blank at the terminus? She'd gone back to the Administrative Reference Manual and read Section 4. The node taxonomy described the ICD's routing architecture in terms of 5 tiers. Tier 1 nodes were visible to all clearance levels. They handled administrative housekeeping, and their identifiers appeared freely in routing logs at every level. Tier 2 and Tier 3 nodes operated the bulk of the program's operational routing and were visible to operatives at Tier 2 and above. Tier 4 nodes were the ceiling of her clearance. She could see their content if the records they processed were within her access range, and she could see their identifiers in routing logs. Tier 5 nodes were described in Section 4 in a single paragraph that managed to be careful and evasive at once. They operated above Tier 4. Their content was inaccessible to her. Their identifiers did not appear in standard routing displays at her level. The section moved on after that paragraph to classification criteria and maintenance schedules, without elaborating on what Tier 5 nodes actually did or who operated them. The footnote was at the bottom of the page in smaller type, listed as a reference note for administrative cross-referencing purposes. It said, in the dry, impersonal language of the manual, Tier 5 node tags may appear in the metadata fields of lower-tier records where those records have been processed by or routed through a Tier 5 node for system integrity verification purposes. She'd read that line 3 times. Metadata fields, not content fields, not routing fields. The metadata, the administrative bookkeeping the system attached to every record, a layer of structural information that described how a record had moved through the system, not what it contained, where it had been, what had touched it. Metadata was accessible at all clearance tiers because you needed to read metadata to do basic administrative work, and because metadata was generally considered too granular and too divorced from content to constitute a security concern. If a Tier 5 node had processed a record, had touched it, routed it, made any decision about it, that node's tag would appear in the record's metadata field, visible to anyone at any clearance level who thought to look for it. She built a search string. The process took 2 days of careful work, because the manual described the tag's existence without describing its format, and she'd had to infer the format from the examples given in the taxonomy tables. She tested the inference against records she already had access to see if the search returned results she could cross-check against known data. The first 3 versions of the string returned nothing. That could mean no Tier 5 records in range, or it could mean her format was wrong. She'd rebuilt the string twice, adjusting the parameter structure each time based on what she could infer from the taxonomy examples. The 4th version had returned results, 41 records in a 90-day window carrying Tier 5 node tags in their metadata. The process of working through those 41 records was slow by design. The system didn't support bulk shell retrieval at her tier. She had to request each one individually, wait for the return, note what she'd found, and move on. 41 individual queries over the course of 3 days, mixed in with the administrative cross-reference queries she was running as cover, meant roughly 14 query sessions per day, more than she'd normally run in an unstructured between-assignment period. She compensated by spacing the sessions across the day and by framing each one around a legitimate administrative task first, so the session as a whole looked like routine housekeeping with a few cross-reference queries at the end. The order varied too, not pulling the routing shells first, not working through the 41 in any sequence that revealed the direction she was moving. She pulled the administrative records first, noted them, moved on. 1 or 2 routing shells buried in the middle of each session, not at the start. Anyone reading her access log as a timeline would see a scattered pattern of record access, not a focused extraction. Imperfect. A smart analyst with the right access and enough attention could still read the pattern. She was working on the assumption that no one was watching that closely, or that if they were watching, the pattern she was creating was ambiguous enough to explain. No way of knowing if that bet was right. She'd made it anyway because the alternative was to stop. The records themselves she couldn't open. The content was above her tier, but she could see their shells, the administrative envelope of each record, the fields that described its structure without describing its substance. Record type, creation date, classification tier, routing status, metadata tags. She cataloged all 41 in the legal pad and spent an afternoon sorting them by record type. Most were standard administrative types that might reasonably touch a Tier 5 node in the course of normal processing. Clearance review files, operational authorization records, infrastructure maintenance logs. She'd set those aside. 3 records were routing shells. A routing shell was a record type she knew well. When a file moved through the ICD's routing system, the system created a separate shell alongside it, a document that contained the structural data of the file's movement but not the file's content itself. The shell was the map of the journey, origin timestamp, profile tag, routing path, delivery status. Shells were retained in the index indefinitely, accessible to the assigning operative as long as the operation remained unarchived. She'd opened all 3. The first 2 matched the anomalous assignments she'd already been tracking. Confirming them in the Tier 5 context told her something the initial traces hadn't. The blank terminus wasn't a standard access limitation at her tier. It was a Tier 5 terminus. The routing paths for both assignments had originated from, or been managed through, infrastructure at the Tier 5 level. Her original working assumption had been that someone with unusual access was routing work to her channel. The corrected assumption was, someone with access to Tier 5 infrastructure was managing her channel. That difference mattered in terms of what it implied about who. The 3rd routing shell was one she hadn't seen before. Created mid-August, approximately 8 weeks before the first anomalous assignment she'd received. The record type matched standard assignment file architecture. Visible in the shell, the profile tag. She'd pulled her own profile parameters from her induction records and laid them next to the shell's profile tag and gone through the fields one by one. The ICD's profile tagging used 3 layers: broad layer, clearance tier and operational division, shared with dozens of operatives. The middle layer covered assignment history categories and primary function type, a smaller group, closers with her tenure and geographic range. At the narrow layer, the tag functioned almost like a name. Assignment history flags from the past 15 years, background qualification codes reflecting her exact recruitment and training path, accumulated operational tenure in the correct year range. Those narrow parameters weren't unique the way a name was unique, but they were unlikely to match anyone else in the program exactly. Close to 1 in the morning, and she'd been at the terminal for 3 hours when she ran that query. She'd almost stopped for the night. The session had felt unproductive. 11 administrative records pulled, nothing connected to the routing anomalies. One routing shell from 3 years prior, an Atlanta operation, nothing irregular. She'd picked the August shell on timing alone, the creation date close enough to the pre-anomaly window that it seemed worth checking before she left. The shell loaded in 11 seconds. She read the structural fields in order, the way she'd been reading all of them. When she hit the profile tag field, she stopped. The tag matched her narrow parameters on every field. She'd stared at that for a long time. Long enough that the steam pipe knocked twice while she sat motionless. Long enough that when she finally wrote in the legal pad, her handwriting came out smaller and more controlled than it usually did. She wrote, "Third file, built for my profile, taken before it reached my channel." Under that, the date. The routing path in the shell told the rest of it. Standard distribution movement through the expected handoffs. Everything ordinary until a point approximately 2 steps before her channel, and then a change. A lateral branch. A routing decision that moved the file off the standard path onto a branch terminating at the same blank designation she'd seen twice before. The same absence. The same Tier 5 wall. She could see the point where the file had stopped coming toward her. Where it had gone was invisible. What it had contained, equally so. A third column went into the legal pad, intercepted file, August. 2 handoffs out, same terminus. The column matched the other 2 on every structural point. 3 routing events, 3 Tier 5 node tags, the same blank at the end each time. She put the pen down. Sitting back from the desk, she looked at the legal pad. 3 columns, 23 lines of handwritten notes in her own compressed shorthand. If someone found this pad, they'd need 15 minutes and a working knowledge of the ICD's routing architecture to understand what they were looking at. But they wouldn't need 15 minutes. Anyone with the right background would read it in 3. She thought about that for a moment, practically. The legal pad had been in her interior jacket pocket since she started this work, and it went back in her pocket when she left each night. It didn't stay in the office. The risk was physical loss, and physical loss required someone to be near her. She'd been careful about that for 15 years. A fresh page. The question she'd been working around all week, the one she hadn't written down yet, how long? She could establish when the asset designation had first shown activity in the accessible metadata, which gave her an earliest confirmed date of 11 months ago. The intercepted routing shell, created 8 weeks ago. The first anomalous assignment, 11 weeks ago, but those were dates she could see. The structure she was mapping might be older than all of them. She'd been thinking about what a Tier 5 operation looked like in its early phase, before it had accumulated 11 months of visible activity. In its early phase, it would look like nothing at all. The metadata would carry no Tier 5 tags because the node hadn't touched any records she had access to yet. The routing paths would be clean because the managing hadn't started, or had started but hadn't crossed into territory she'd notice. Invisible at her tier, the whole structure. That was how a program was supposed to be. She wrote the question at the top of the page, how long before the first visible event? Under it she wrote, no way to determine from below. She underlined the second line. There was no query she could run that would surface the full duration of the Tier 5 structure. She could see what had left marks on records she could access. The earlier phase was invisible, the operation running cleanly above her, not yet crossing into visible range. The program might have been in place for 2 years or 5. No way to know. She put a second underline under the first and moved on. What she did have was the Portland thread, and the Portland thread gave her a reference point. She noted the contact in October of the prior year, during the VIR's network work. If the contact had become an asset in approximately that window, which the status timestamp suggested, then whoever was managing this had been watching her operational work closely enough to recognize a loose thread she'd noted in passing and had turned that thread into something. That was not a detail about the size of the operation. It was a detail about the attention. Someone had read her network notes from the VIR's operation. She sat with that. Not unusual on its face. Network documentation from a close was reviewed by people above her chain as a matter of course. The Portland contact in the VIR's file had been flagged as peripherally adjacent and filed in the documentation, and anyone with access to that file could have read the flag. She didn't know who had access to the VIR's operation file above her clearance tier. No reason to find out before now. But someone had read her note, the expect recurrence flag, and had acted on it, had taken the loose thread and picked it up and started running it. Through infrastructure she couldn't trace, through an asset designation she could only see the shell of, through Tier 5 architecture that didn't leave footprints at her level except in the margins of the system's own bookkeeping. She added a line to the fourth column, operational note in Veer's file. Someone read it. Acted within same window. The Portland thread needed confirming. She pulled up the Veer's network file through her operational history access. The file was still open to her. She was the assigning operative on the Minneapolis close, and the operation hadn't been formally archived yet. She noticed that 3 days ago and logged it as a data point without conclusions. Archiving ran behind schedule. It was possible that was all it was. Casimir Veers had been a mid-tier procurement contractor with access to a supply channel. The ICD had flagged for security review in early 2028. She'd received the assignment in October of the prior year, worked his network for 6 days, and completed the close on a Tuesday afternoon in a parking garage off 6th Street North in Minneapolis. Filed and moved on without looking back at the network documentation, the way she moved on from every clean close. The network work had been methodical and largely uneventful. Veers ran a small network, 4 primary contacts, 2 downstream connections, 1 supply chain intermediary. She'd mapped all of them in the pre-close documentation, assessed each for operational significance, and determined that none warranted independent action. The close was clean. 1 entry hadn't been clearly ordinary, 2 steps out from Veers. A name that appeared at the edge of a financial structure Veers had been tangentially connected to, not directly, through a wire transfer service that had touched both a Veers-adjacent account and a Pacific Northwest routing number. No ICD file on it. No operational flag, no security history. She'd assessed it as someone in Veers's extended financial periphery, uninvolved in the supply channel directly, worth noting. Adjacent, uninvolved. Flag for monitoring. Expect recurrence. That was what she'd written. She'd written that 11 months ago. 3 days ago, working through the 41 Tier 5 metadata records, she'd found an asset designation marker embedded in the metadata of one of the administrative records she couldn't open. Asset designations were a record type she knew from operational briefing materials, even though she'd never been cleared into asset management. The ICD ran sources, people inside organizations, inside networks, inside places the program needed visibility into, and those people carried internal classifications as assets. The designation marker existed in the metadata at her tier for deconfliction purposes. She'd pulled the marker's associated fields: regional code, Pacific Northwest, status, active, operational status timestamp going back at least 11 months, the Tier 5 node tag in the metadata, the same blank terminus in the associated routing records. She'd gone back into the Veers network file and found the Portland entry. The match wasn't certain. Pacific Northwest was a large region, but the Veers file had exactly 1 Pacific Northwest connection, and the timeline aligned. She'd written it in the legal pad with a question mark alongside it because a question mark was more accurate than false certainty. The question mark stayed. A 4th column, Portland asset, Pacific Northwest, active 11 months, Tier 5 node tag, same terminus. The 4 columns matched on every structural element that mattered, 1 piece of architecture touching everything. She turned to a fresh page in the legal pad, explanations written at the top, underlined. The first, an internal integrity test. The ICD ran them. She'd been through 1 in her 3rd year, a single anomalous assignment delivered with ambiguous parameters, a quiet debrief 2 weeks later. Integrity tests were standard and designed to look like what they were testing for. She'd known that afterward. But integrity tests were single-event structures. You designed a scenario, exposed an operative to it, captured the response, and concluded. What she'd found was 3 routing instances across a 12-week window, an asset being run for at least 11 months, an infrastructure that had been in place before the first event she'd noticed. No integrity test built 11 months of asset management to create a false impression in 1 operative. The scale and duration were wrong. She crossed off the first explanation. The second, a parallel operation she was adjacent to but not involved in. higher classification work running above her tier, and the anomalous routing events in her channel were an artifact of proximity, her profile brushing against an operation she wasn't read in on. The routing system generating overlaps that looked, from below, like deliberate management. Higher classification operations would look exactly like Tier 5 infrastructure from her access level. The blank terminus would look exactly like a parallel operations routing firewall. It was a plausible explanation. She'd been living with it for 3 days, and she'd been slowly taking it apart. The problem was always the intercepted file. She kept coming back to it, and it kept not fitting. Every construction collapsed at the same point. She tried. Higher classification operation with parameters overlapping hers. Higher classification operation with parameters overlapping hers. Routing system generating a false profile match. File routed toward her channel by the distribution system's own error, then caught and redirected by someone doing routine deconfliction. That would explain the redirect. That would even explain the Tier 5 terminus. What it wouldn't explain was the construction. The file had been constructed with her narrow parameters. The narrow parameters weren't a general profile type. You didn't construct a file to someone's narrow profile parameters by accident. You did it by looking up that person's profile and building to it. The construction was the act that broke every alternative she'd been able to build. It was a decision. Somebody made a decision to build a file for her. She crossed off the second explanation. The third entry on the page was not an explanation. She'd written it as a fact, or as close to a fact as the evidence supported. One person, inside the ICD, operating at or through Tier 5 access, managing her channel, choosing what reached her and what didn't. Running an asset she'd noted as a loose thread 11 months ago, before her read-in, before she'd noticed anything. The program had been in place before she started watching for it. The managing had predated her awareness of it by at least a year. She didn't know who. Reporting it was impossible. The reporting problem was unpleasant to sit with because it had no exit. She'd need to choose a recipient. The ICD had an internal oversight function, nominally independent of the operational chain, designed to receive exactly this kind of report. She'd known about the oversight function for 15 years. 15 years and never used it, not because she didn't trust the concept. The occasions that called for it were rare. This was the occasion. The oversight function was administered above Tier 4. She held that fact still and looked at it. Whoever was managing her channel had Tier 5 access. The oversight function operated at Tier 5 or above. No confirmation possible from her clearance level that the oversight function was operating independently of the person she'd be reporting. No way to identify who was above her chain. No recipient she could choose with any confidence the report wouldn't route back to the hand she'd been mapping. She'd also considered the alternative to official channels. A lateral conversation with someone she trusted inside the program. Someone whose clearance might give her a different view of the architecture she was mapping. 2 names fit that category. 2 people in the ICD she'd worked alongside long enough to have a read on their integrity, whose clearance tiers she wasn't certain of but suspected were above her own. She turned those names over for a few minutes and then set them aside. Reaching out to either of them, even carefully, even obliquely, would register as a movement in a direction. Right now she was trying not to create signals. She didn't have enough yet. What she needed was something that turned the structure from a shape into a thing she could act on. She didn't have that. The shape of a hand on her channel and the absence of everything above it, that was what she had. Everything went into the watching place. All 4 columns, the complete structure she'd built over 4 days. Present on the surface, attended to, not filed and not set down. The watching place was for things she was still turning toward. She kept it there the same way she kept a developing contact in view during the pre-close period of an operation. Visible, not resolved, not finished. The drawer stayed closed. Outside, a car moved slowly through the intersection at P in Wisconsin, headlights sweeping a pale bar across the wall and then gone. The clock on the terminal said 3:47 in the morning. The steam pipe knocked once and settled. She'd been in this room for close to 4 hours, and the cold had worked into her shoulders in the way cold did when you sat still too long in a room that was technically heated, but hadn't been occupied long enough for the heat to do anything. Nothing saved to the terminal. Her working notes were on paper, in the legal pad which would leave with her. The terminal's access log would show her query history. The logging was at the infrastructure level, below anything she could touch, but she'd left no data in the system. No saved searches, no flagged records, nothing written in any system field. A person looking at her access log from above her tier would see an operative running administrative queries across the backbone in irregular patterns over 4 days. They would be correct about what they were seeing. What she'd concluded wasn't in the system. The conclusion was on paper. She locked the terminal, turned off the desk lamp. The room went orange-gray from the streetlight through the window, Wisconsin Avenue's ambient glow laying a dull rectangle on the wall. The bare oak branches at the corner of P and 30th were visible through the glass black lines against the city-gray sky. She stood in that light for a moment, coat in hand, not quite ready to move, and then she put the coat on, gathered the legal pad, and tucked it into the interior left pocket of her jacket. The stairs down, N Street instead of P. Not shorter, it wasn't, by about half a block, but different, and different was the point. An old practice that had become automatic, the small variation that kept her movement from becoming predictable. The air outside was cold in the way late October became November. Not sharp, not the clean blade cold of December, but something grayer and more patient. Cold that came from surfaces, brick and pavement and iron fences giving up the last heat they'd stored since summer, releasing it slowly into the night. Her breath showed in the glow of a street lamp on Dumbarton and then disappeared. The streets were empty. Georgetown at 4 in the morning was the most purely itself it ever got. The neighborhood stripped of the performance it put on during daylight hours and reduced to what it actually was. Old brick, iron railings, the specific silence of a place that had been wealthy for a long time and did not need to explain itself. She passed a hardware store on Dumbarton, closed and dark. A garden behind an iron fence, bare until April. A brownstone with one light still on behind a ground floor curtain. Someone up late or the light left on. No way to know which. She let herself into her building at 4:03. The corridor on her floor was lit by 2 fixtures at opposite ends. Low wattage, the kind of light that was technically present and practically somewhere between dim and absent. She was halfway to her apartment when she heard sounds from the far end of the hall. A single footstep, a metallic rattle, the scratch of something being worked loose from a wall bracket. Walt was standing near the far fixture, the one above the fire door, 1 foot on the second step of a folding step stool, working a burned bulb free from the socket, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, keys on the retractable clip at his hip, a small plastic bag folded in his breast pocket for the dead bulb. He had the focused patience of a man who'd done this exact task many times and felt no need to hurry it. Down from the step stool when she was close enough that not acknowledging her would have required effort. "Late one," he said. "Yeah." He turned the dead bulb over in his hand once and put it in the bag. "Heat lamp in the lobby's out too," he said. "Different delivery though, Tuesday they told me." He said it in the way he said things that were peripheral information, not particularly important, just worth noting, the small ongoing facts of the building's condition that he tracked because tracking them was the job. "Okay," she said. He folded the step stool. "Supposed to drop overnight, cold-wise." "I heard that." "Well." He tucked the step stool under his arm and moved toward the stairwell door, unhurried, the slight hitch in his left knee. The door opened, closed. The new bulb made the end of the corridor a shade brighter. She went into her apartment. The apartment faced the interior courtyard, which was dark except for 1 path lamp still burning at the far end. The ivy on the far wall had gone brown and half-stripped over the past few weeks. She could see the brick behind it in the places where the leaves had let go. The brick was more honest, older and more honest about what it was. A glass of water from the dark kitchen, the tap handle and the glass familiar without the light. She drank most of it at the counter. 6 in the previous evening, the last meal, the hunger was present, mild, not urgent enough to do anything about it 4 in the morning. The glass went down. Left in her pocket, the legal pad alongside it now. She felt both through the jacket fabric without reaching inside, the photograph flat and familiar, the legal pad a slightly stiffer rectangle beside it. She didn't take either out. Her hand stayed at the pocket for a moment, and then she moved away from the counter. She sat in the chair by the window. The courtyard was still. One path lamp, its light spreading across the brick and the brown ivy and the dead leaves on the flagstones. The oak at the courtyard's edge was bare, its branches precise against the dark sky. She looked at it without focusing on anything. The count stood at 46. She thought about it briefly, the way she thought about it most days, without sentiment and without any expectation that thinking about it would alter it. 46 was the number. It had weight that didn't change with her attention to it. Since the read-in, the count had acquired context it hadn't had before. Not new weight exactly, different texture. Before the read-in, the number had been a number, carried in the same way she carried the procedural facts of her work. After, the number had dimension. She understood more fully what it was. Understanding didn't make it lighter. She sat in the chair until the room's dimensions reasserted themselves in the dark. Then she got up, changed her clothes, turned back the bed. She left the curtain as it was. The single path lamp in the courtyard sent a thin, bright line along the floor where the curtain didn't quite meet the baseboard. She lay on her back. The ceiling was invisible. The room made its sounds, the building settling in the cold, small creaks from the joists. A refrigerator hummed from the kitchen, cycling on and off. A car passing on the street 2 blocks south, far enough away that the sound arrived softened and imprecise. The city at 4:30 in the morning doing what it did at 4:30, which was mostly nothing. And mostly nothing had a texture she'd learned over 7 years in this apartment. The ambient texture of a neighborhood resting, the base layer of sound beneath everything else. She wasn't trying to sleep yet. She wasn't going over the 4 columns again either. There was a version of late-night review that was useful, productive, the working through that led somewhere. The difference between that and the compulsive kind was clear. The pushing at a door that wasn't going to open until she had something new to push with. The shape she'd found was the shape she had. The next steps would have to be slow. Slow was the only speed that didn't show up in the access logs as a straight line pointing at something, and slow meant tomorrow, and the day after that. She thought about the cover she'd built for the queries and whether it would hold. Practically, without anxiety. The access log for the past 4 days showed patterns that could be explained. Someone asking directly would get an explanation. Whether that explanation was believed depended on who was asking and what they were looking for, and she didn't know who might be asking. She'd done what she could do. Walt and the bulb in the corridor. 28 years in this building, doing the small maintenance of it at 4 in the morning without making anything of it. She had something like respect for the consistency of it. The commitment to a piece of work done quietly and without announcement. The feeling went unexamined. The refrigerator cycled off. The room was quieter without it. What her mind kept returning to without choosing to, the way water found the same path, was not the 4 columns or the routing paths or the Tier 5 node tag showing up in everything. What she kept returning to was the intercepted file. Specifically the absence of it. The routing shell showing a file built to her narrow parameters, moving through the system toward her channel and then not arriving. 2 handoffs out, that was where the branch was. The blank at the terminus. She didn't know what the file had contained. That was a fixed limit with a clean edge. She'd never know the substance, and she'd accepted it when she found the shell, and she accepted it now. What she couldn't set aside was the shape of the absence itself. The fact that something had been made for her, built in the program's own language of parameters and routing codes to say her name, sent in her direction, and then taken before it arrived. 2 handoffs out from her channel, close enough that the routing decision to redirect it had been made by someone who could see the path the file was on, who had the access to touch the distribution architecture at that point. The managing was what mattered. The hand on her channel choosing. Before her read-in, before she'd noticed anything, the hand had been there. It had been there while she was moving through the operational periods she'd thought of as clean. Those assignments had been clean because the person managing her channel had decided to let them through. The ones she'd received in the last 11 weeks were the anomalies. The rest of it was also a choice. She lay in the dark and thought about the shape of a thing that wasn't there.